Have you ever thought about how your professional life impacted your own baby feeding experiences, or how your baby feeding experiences changed the course of your professional life? My guest today is a professional when it comes to breast health. She is a registered radiologist assistant, which is a profession that I had never heard of before. So I'm excited for you to hear about how her baby feeding experiences impacted her choices as a professional, and also how her choices as a professional impacted how she ended up feeding her babies. She specializes in women's health and knows a lot about breasts. So today she is sharing her baby feeding experiences, but then in 2 days, on Thursday, when my quick hit episode drops, Courtney will be my special guest talking all about breast anatomy and breast function and the things that she sees as a registered radiologist assistant. So I'm so happy for you to hear both of these episodes. Enjoy. Have you ever stopped to consider why so many humans struggle to feed human milk to their human babies in recent history? Have you then looked around and noticed that so few animals in the animal kingdom struggle to do the same? My name is Lo Nigarash. I am an internationally board-certified lactation consultant, or an IBCLC, and a childbirth educator, and I have been thinking about this for a long time. Come uncover the barriers that make feeding our babies so difficult through conversations with people who have breastfed and pumped, through evidence-based information around breastfeeding and pumping and human milk making, and through conversations with other experts in the field. So that one podcast episode at a time, we chip away at these barriers and make breastfeeding easier for everyone. You've heard me now for a few months talking about how much I've enjoyed getting home-cooked meals delivered right to my front door from feastandfettle.com. And I'm here today to tell you that if you know somebody who is in the postpartum period, who you would like to provide true support to, that you should go to feastandfettle.com and order home-cooked meals to be delivered right to their front door. One of the biggest barriers to breastfeeding success is a lack of support. A new parent is feeding a baby up to 15 times a day. How on earth do we expect that person to feed that baby that many times, also feed themselves, and provide meals to other members of their family? There's not enough time. You know how hard it is as a busy parent yourself to try to put meals on the table. Go to feastandfettle.com, use my code MILK, MILK, coordinate which meals they would like to have delivered, and send them a week's worth of delicious meals. And be the person who eases the burden for them. What a gift. I can't think of a better way to support somebody in the postpartum period.
My name is Courtney Yeager. I live in southeastern Connecticut with my family. I have my husband, Ryan, and I have 3 boys. My oldest just turned 5 this week. I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. Yeah.
All right. So before we get into your baby feeding stories, I would love to take you back to your childhood, to your cultural upbringing, and have you talk about what exposure you had to baby feeding throughout your childhood and into your teen years, and what you knew about baby feeding and breastfeeding before you were thinking about doing it yourself.
Yeah, I love that question because I love thinking about it. It's so interesting. My mother, I'm the oldest of 3 as well, and she breastfed us all for short periods of time. I'm actually not even sure the length of time, but 3 months is something that always sticks in my head, and then I know that we were formula fed after that. Her breastfeeding the advice, I feel like back then, looked very different, and the support looked very different. I remember, like, when I was a little bit older, around 10 years old, seeing my cousins being breastfed when they were newborns, and it was such a hush thing. My aunt was in the front room breastfeeding, and you weren't really encouraged to go in there, or actually encouraged to stay out of there because she needed her privacy and her time with her baby. It wasn't so much, and to no one's fault, it just wasn't something that was celebrated as much. It was very much a private ritual, if you will.
Yeah, and that's interesting to think about. In some ways, it's nice to protect that space with mom and baby. And in other ways, if we just saw it all the time everywhere, it wouldn't need to be so protected. It's like a balancing act of figuring out what each dyad needs.
Right. And what works for you, of course. But it is interesting when you think about it as something that's more just integrated into the family lifestyle. It's not something that needs to be so hidden all the time.
Yeah, exactly. And then did you ever see, as a child, did you have baby dolls and bottles? Did you babysit? Was it mostly formula when you babysat? What was that like?
Yes. So I definitely had baby dolls. They all had bottles. Some of them had milk. Some of them even were bottles of juice.
I remember those.
Yeah, the ones that would like empty themselves. It was like orange juice or something, which is interesting. And yeah, when I babysat a lot, and it was really mostly formula. It was all pre-prepared. I never remember heating up breast milk.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So then take me to preparing to be a mom yourself and what you were thinking about your own goals in terms of breastfeeding.
Yeah. And that's another interesting question. And I feel like it plays so much into how I prepared for pregnancy as well. I, from a very early age, was always fascinated with pregnancy. I loved pregnancy. I loved seeing women that were pregnant. I loved babies, so much so that it affected me professionally. But when I was pregnant with my first, I actually changed care providers at 33 weeks pregnant. And there were just some red flags that were coming up related to the size of the baby, things like that. And I knew very early on that it just wasn't aligned with, this provider wasn't aligned with what I was feeling. So I chose to take a hypnobirthing class to help better prepare for the type of birth and that I thought that I wanted to have. And inherently through that, I also took a breastfeeding class as well. So equally became as passionate about preparing for breastfeeding as I was for pregnancy. Even that late in the game of my pregnancy, it felt like a very heavy decision at the time because felt like it was down to the last minutes, but it turns out it was like one of the best decisions that I've ever made because it's had so many implications even beyond just that first birth and breastfeeding experience.
Yeah. And the birth experience that you have, not just the outcome of the birth, not just the type of birth you have, but how you feel during the birth experience, whether or not you feel listened to, and even during your care in the prenatal period, have long-lasting impacts on how you feel as a parent going into the postpartum period. And so it's really great that you listen to those red flags and listen to your own feelings about those red flags, and then decided, you know what, I am going to make a change, and didn't push those things down.
Yeah, it was definitely the right decision for me. And I'm the kind of person that when there is a red flag, I always want to understand it, all layers of it, the pros, the cons, the risks, the benefits of everything. And only then do I usually feel comfortable in making a decision. And whatever the outcome may be, like you said, usually whatever that is, I ended up feeling better about that, whether it was through the birth or even during my breastfeeding journey. Just having that knowledge under my belt made a big difference.
Yeah. Now, I just want to take you back a little bit because you said your fascination with birth and pregnancy had an impact on your career choice. So will you tell me about that really briefly?
Sure. So when I was in high school, you don't really know what you want to do, but I knew I wanted to take pictures of babies. So that turned into ultrasounds, and that led into a whole career of being in radiology. I went to school for X-ray and ultrasound, and ultimately to grad school as a registered radiologist assistant with a main focus in women's health. So that has become largely my career path that I still remain very passionate about today.
Oh, wow. So tell me what, like all the training that you have to do to get there. And actually, so my listeners know, you're telling your personal story now. And then the same week that this episode releases, you're going to come back and you're going to talk all about breast health.
Yes.
From your professional experiences. But I just want to hear briefly what it takes to become a radiology assistant, because
Yes.
that included graduate school, which I was not aware of. You told me it was similar to like a PA, so I should have recognized that. But
yeah, it's a newer field and there's not that many of us. So a lot of people don't know, but essentially in college, I studied diagnostic imaging. So I graduated with my bachelor's as an X-ray technician as well as an ultrasound technologist. So I was able to work per diem in those fields as I went to grad school to, like you said, get my master's specifically as an RA. And I was trained in all of radiology. It was more my decision to specialize to support women's imaging and breast health.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. So you have seen a lot of babies and a lot of breasts,
yes.
I can imagine.
Yes. In all different ways. Yeah. It's been great. I love it.
Yeah. Man, that could take me down a whole rabbit hole of questions, but we're going to focus on your baby feeding experiences.
Yes.
Okay. You switched providers at around 33 weeks, and then tell me about any prep you did. You took a breastfeeding class. Is there anything else you did? Did you meet with an IBCLC or go to a breastfeeding support group or anything prenatally?
I didn't. No, okay. I didn't know to be honest. The only thing I did when I was drawn to my pediatrician's office, I knew did offer an IBCLC lactation consultant on site. So I felt really comfortable with that option for support if needed. But that was the only other thing that I really looked into in terms of for support.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then did your experience as somebody who had done imaging of breasts and who understood the anatomy of a breast, did having that knowledge impact you in any way as you were preparing for breastfeeding? Did you understand the physiology of human milk feeding in a way that maybe some other people don't?
I will say I did, of course, from the anatomy and physiology courses that I had to take from my education, but I would say no, because I think my understanding of it all really deepened as I was going through the process of feeding my baby. And then also what I didn't mention is the little pivot or add on to my career to become involved with lactation education, because I became equally as passionate about breastfeeding as well. But yeah, no, from the beginning, I think I did have more of a basic understanding from the science perspective. And I think maybe the thing that stood out more so than it might for somebody else is I just knew to ask questions. So that with my medical background was definitely something that has continued to help me.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so if you want to, I don't know where you want to take us as far as baby feeding goes, but you can take me where you want to go.
Sure. So yeah, with my first son, I had like classic hypnobirthing experience. Breastfeeding was established right away, and it was really lovely. It was everything I had envisioned it to be. Of course, there was the feeling of the first latch was unique, and then but even in that, even though ultimately I went on to breastfeed him for 3 years, essentially, there were still little bumps along the way that a lot of people focus on the success right away. And I think just at any given point in the journey, it can always look different. Like I was somebody that really struggled with engorgement right away, to the point where even my husband and my mom were like, what is happening? Is this normal? Is this okay? And I really struggled with that at first. The discomfort, I remember that was the point I was trying to reach out to a lactation consultant in the middle of the night I needed help. And my son, my Ash, he struggled to keep up with that fast letdown at first, but then we overcame that. And then eventually it turned into he was biting, and that was something I didn't expect. So just learning to navigate all of these little hiccups or little bumps in the road along the way. It's just like a kind of a continuum, and it just looks different at any given point. And so even though overall it was an amazing experience. Like you can break it down into little sections, and everybody has those little struggles, I feel.
Yeah. And so when you say immediate engorgement, what does that mean for you? Like day 1 or?
I would say day 3 for me. It was day 3.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the biting, was that as a result of the engorgement, or did that happen later on when he was older?
It happened later on, mainly coincided with teething. And I can say that with confidence now because all 3 of my boys have done the same thing around the same time. And or learning when my flow slows down, that they can play around or bite to encourage another letdown, essentially.
Yeah. So you have this fast flow in the beginning.
Yes.
That's almost overwhelming, but then the baby becomes accustomed to that flow. And so then they might become chompy or gummy.
Yes.
And then when they have teeth,
yes.
it becomes even worse to try to get that faster flow because that's what they're accustomed to.
Exactly.
Yeah, that can be challenging.
Yes. Yeah, it was. And that was with my first around 8 months, I actually reached out to our local La Leche League group to get support because at that point, a lot of my friends weren't breastfeeding anymore. The moms and the families that I knew from having my son around the time that we did had either stopped or were mostly formula feeding at that point. So that was a lonely time, and La Leche League was able to provide some of that support in letting me know that this can be normal and this too is a phase and it will pass and on to the next thing. So that was at that point a resource that became extremely helpful for me.
And what did that support look like? Was it calling somebody? Was it online groups? Was it in person?
It was, for me, it was in person. I found the contact info online. I think it was through Facebook, and I went to a meeting, but I know now they do. I'm actually a leader as well.
Oh, great.
Yeah. And calling, texting, emailing, even there's discussion groups in Leche League discussion groups on Facebook, and all of those can be outlets for support.
Yeah, great. Okay. But did you go multiple times? Like, did you continue to go to an in-person group to get that support?
I did. It was so nice to be just surrounded by other families that were feeding their babies in the same way. And it didn't even have to be exactly the same way. Some were combo feeding or whatever, but just even though I didn't have a question or a problem necessarily every time there was a meeting, I just went to hear other people's experiences, put things into perspective, maybe take a little pearl of wisdom away that might apply to me. It was just nice.
I hear this so commonly that the people who do decide to reach out and go sit in a room full of people who are experiencing something similar enough to you.
Yeah.
And to have similar enough goals when it comes to baby feeding and similar enough struggles and similar enough joys.
Yeah.
When it comes to feeding their babies, there's just something about getting that support in person that can't be replaced in any other way. And that adds to the experience of baby feeding and that provides a level of support that you can't get anywhere else. Are you now recognizing that you might need more in-person support? It really can make all the difference. I have a couple of options for you if you are looking for support that is dedicated to you, that is streamlined, that is specific to your situation, your family dynamics, your responsibilities outside of feeding babies. I would love to be the person that supports you in person or virtually, one-on-one, to help you feel really good about feeding your baby. If you are encountering a difficulty a difficulty of engorgement, like Courtney mentions, or perhaps you have abundant milk and it leads to recurrent mastitis, or maybe you are wondering how you can increase your supply or feel more comfortable pumping, or you would like to create a pumping plan as you go back to work. All of these topics are done so easily virtually, and I want to be the person who helps you meet your goals or adjust them so that you feel really good about feeding your baby. Additionally, if you are local to Central Massachusetts and you would like to attend my monthly breastfeeding support group, it happens the first Wednesday of the month at Smokestack Coffee Roasters in Lunenburg. From 10:30 to 11:30, you can come get amazing pastries, sit in a room with other people who get how you are feeling and who can provide suggestions and support. And of course, I will be there too as an IBCLC to help supplement that support you get from your peers. Can't wait to see you there.
100%. And it even goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning, that whole kind of community perception of breastfeeding and how this kind of support can help change that it really is breastfeeding in public or feeding your baby on the go whenever you need to is okay. And it's something that you can be comfortable with if that's the right choice for you.
Yeah, we are making a cultural shift. And as much as there's this attitude out there that everybody knows that breast is best, and 88% or something like that of people attempt breastfeeding in the beginning now in the United States, there is still this feeling that we are reinventing the wheel because it was lost for multiple generations. And now we're really trying to bring it back and make it the norm again.
Yeah.
And that takes, it's emotionally toll. It takes an emotional toll on those of us who are really trying to do it in whatever form that looks like for your family. And it's not going to look exactly the same as it did 100 years ago because culturally it looks different. So we're trying to both bring it back and adapt to what our modern families look like. And it is challenging. It feels hard because it is hard. And getting that support in that way is so important.
Yeah.
And it's not the same. And if the only thing you can do is go online to a Facebook group, fantastic. If all you can do is text a Lala leader or some other person who has fed their baby in a similar way, great. But if you can get in person to a group, do it because it can't be replaced.
100%. Yes, I couldn't have said it better. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So did you go to La Leche League throughout feeding all three babies, or did it get harder as you had more children?
It got harder because first of all, I wasn't necessarily, I guess I could have, it's always encouraged to bring children with you, but it was very distracting for me to bring my 2-year-old to a La Leche League meeting. But also my second was born the week COVID hit. So that experience was inherently much different. Yeah. And I think since then now the in-person meetings are just resuming back to whatever the new normal is before that happened.
Did lockdown begin before the birth of your child or right after?
The week I was in the hospital and they weren't even sure what the mask policy was. So It was very scary. Nobody knew what was going on. The stays in the hospital were decreased. The lactation support was decreased. I felt lucky that I was a second-time mom and knew a little bit about what to expect. But yeah, it was very different, and which led to a very different feeding journey. Not in the sense it was still successful as my first one. I was home more. It was just constantly balancing having the baby and the toddler myself and feeding and entertaining the older one. It was, very different.
And you were still nursing the older one, right? Because you said you fed him for 3 years.
I did. Yes. I fed him all through my second pregnancy and then for a year of tandem feeding.
Yeah. So what did that look like?
It was interesting. He was always he would watch the baby feed. And I felt like that was such a beautiful thing because he would put the pieces together. And I loved that. And he didn't really ever get jealous. A lot of people would talk about the older baby getting jealous, but it was interesting for me because the feeling of a newborn nursing versus a toddler is very different. So that was something that I was constantly going back and forth between the two. And a lot of times my older son would ask to nurse right after feeding the other baby. So it was like when normally you might have a little bit of a break to be hands-free, it was tending to the needs of the older one after feeding the newborn.
Yeah. Did it make it easier to connect with your older child because there was this automatic way to connect? I know sometimes we'll find it harder to bond with the older child when a new baby has come in, because there's all this attention going to the new baby. So did having that automatic way to bond with them help, or did it actually make it harder because you had to nurse him and then also find other ways to spend time with him?
I would say both, but I think it was nice in the sense that for him, we were continuing to nurse. So he was like, okay, mama's still here. What we had before is still the same. And that was really soothing for both of us, really, but especially for him.
Yeah. Yeah. And being in lockdown during COVID, did it make it easier to tandem feed two babies because you were home already? Or do you think?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I didn't even know how to put that into words. Yes, because on one hand, it made it so much easier to breastfeed. I know he really actually never took a bottle because he didn't need to. I was home all the time. We were home all together. But in the same breath, I constantly had one, if not two babies on me just all the time feeding, which is so amazing in a lot of ways. But it just looked very different.
So the physiology of it was easier, but maybe the impact it had on your mental and emotional health maybe took a toll. Yeah. And any difficulties with the second, with plugged ducts or anything like that?
No, the second was pretty mirror image to my first. And I think, to your point, the physiology of just being together all the time, the constant baby wearing, because I had to be helping the toddler, and tandem feeding just made for that very smooth experience.
Yeah. And I think this highlights one of the barriers to human milk feeding in modern life, is that most of us cannot structure our lives this way. Even for stay-at-home parents, there's so much that we are doing, whether we're working parents or stay-at-home parents. Both are hard.
Yeah, exactly.
In a society where we get so little support and we have so few extra hands, that even outside of that lockdown time, we're so busy, we're running so many errands, we have to go to the grocery store, we have to pick up this and that, and take kids to programs and do all these things, that it's hard to maintain milk supply and carve out the time for feeding. And so that little bit of time, COVID lockdown, for the people who are stuck literally at home with almost nothing to do but feed their babies, because you're not going to the grocery store, you're not going to programs, you're not headed into the office. For some people, it may have improved breastfeeding a little bit.
Yeah, I would say that for sure. And I would say that for me too, it also changed my perceptions of sleep and all of that, because with my second, we did a lot more co-sleeping, and he was just, I was constantly baby wearing him. And so to help soothe, I learned a lot the second time around because we spent so much more time together. Whereas the first time I was maybe going off of more of what family members had told me, or maybe I read a piece of advice online or read something from a book, I was piecing it all together. But being forced into that situation, I just learned.
Yeah.
So much so that it affected. What was that?
I said beauty from ashes.
Right? Yeah. And I was just going to say, though, it carried over into my third. I did things a lot differently with my third compared to my first, just because I think of that experience too.
Yeah. Setting it up intentionally.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk about that? What was your third like?
My third, I will say, was a very different experience. I had a high-risk pregnancy. I was induced at 35 weeks, and he spent a week in the NICU. And it was an experience where I wasn't able to hold him for about 4 days. I had to establish my supply solely on a breast pump and hand expression. So even having been through breastfeeding successfully 2 times, I almost wasn't prepared for that. And there were many moments where I was sitting there pumping every 2 to 3 hours in the middle of the night, thoroughly exhausted mentally and physically. And I couldn't even see how we were going to end up breastfeeding successfully, how he was ever going to latch. So the third time was very different.
Yeah, and that can be really challenging when you're in the midst of it, especially when you know everything about how important it is to establish breastfeeding early on. Skin to skin, all of that, to then be thinking, oh no, it's going the opposite of
Mm-hmm.
the way I need it to know. And you can start to think it will never happen.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so sorry that you had this experience.
I'm thankful in many ways because I think it was through that even as somebody who is really aware about breast health, and at that point I had established some knowledge base in lactation education, it was through that experience I realized how important learning how to hand express is, even before you
Mm.
have the baby, and how all of those things come into play, and
Yeah.
especially in a situation like that.
So had you been hand expressing before the 35-week induction?
I was, but only, I was actually using the pump, I should say. I wasn't hand expressing because I was trying to encourage induction myself. I was trying to move things along as naturally as I could, even though I knew ultimately I was probably going to end up needing to be induced. But I was pumping to hopefully just prime to get things ready. And inherently in that collected some colostrum.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so then baby was in the NICU and was being fed your breast milk in addition to supplementation.
He mostly got my breast milk because I had brought that colostrum that I had harvested early on in trying to induce myself. That was enough to offset my low supply in the beginning until my more mature milk came in. So he did end up needing a little supplementation, but it was very minimal. And that was something that made me feel really good. And I was able to make that decision confidently because I knew I was doing the best that I could to do everything for him. Yes, so I was pumping early on. And then in the hospital, I did meet with a lactation consultant. I forget at what point. I think it was 1 or 2 days after he was born. And that's when we worked on really mastering the hand expression techniques, because ultimately in the early days, that's where I got the biggest yield with getting the colostrum out, was through hand expression and actually not the pump.
Yeah, I know. I see a lot of people in the hospital who are just laying back in the bed with their pump with really incorrect sizing on, and just like pumping for 20 minutes with nothing coming out repeatedly every 2-3 hours. And then they say, I have no milk. And I'm like, the milk is there. We just have to find a different way to get it out.
Yes.
Either with better pumping techniques, or we can use hands.
Yes.
So that's really cool that you had this lactation consultant who really worked on hand expression with you.
Yes. Yes.
Did she work on multiple techniques? Did she show you various ways to hand express, or was it just one way? What did she do?
Just one way. Yeah.
But you were able to be pretty successful with that?
I was determined. Yes, I was determined. Yeah.
Yeah. And so then did you end up mostly hand expressing for a while?
Yeah, I did. Every time I needed to produce or pump every 2 to 3 hours, I would pump for a minute or two to get things flowing. And then I would hand express for a while until the flow started to slow, or I was just tired. And then, but then I would pump for a little bit afterwards just to get that stimulation in to set the foundation for hopefully increasing my supply.
Yeah. Great. And then you were able to provide what your baby needed for that time.
Yes. By the time we left the NICU, the nurses were like, you're good. Because at that point, they almost didn't have enough fridge space for all the milk that I was producing.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing. Yeah. I love that story because it highlights how critical hand expression can be and how impactful. So often we just teach the one way.
Yeah.
And it turns out that for some people, that one way doesn't work. And then they feel discouraged. They're like, oh, I just can't hand express. But there are actually quite a few different ways to hand express. So then how baby was in the NICU for 4 days or long? You just couldn't hold him?
I couldn't hold him for 4 days. I couldn't hold him consistently for 4 days. I think at around 3 to 4 days, they would let me take him out maybe for an hour each day. He had to be under the lights for jaundice, and it was pretty intense. So I really could only hold him for maybe an hour or so every day until day 4. And then I was able to nurse him, but I was still using the pump a lot. And I would say even for a couple weeks afterwards, he was so little and he wasn't latching well. So we would practice latching, but then ultimately I would have to pump to get the milk out and bottle feed him to make sure that he was getting the nutrients that he needed, until eventually somewhere along the way it just clicked. And then eventually we were breastfeeding more than I was pumping. And now he's 14 months and he's Now he won't take a bottle. Now he
yes.
only breastfeeds. So.
Oh, no. Yeah, that switch happens sometimes.
Yes.
So was there ever a worry in your mind when you were making the transition from bottle feeding, especially for a NICU baby who was born a little bit early? Did you ever have this concern not knowing the number of ounces he was getting at your breast? Because I know that this is a worry for a lot of people who start out with pumping and bottle feeding. They feel really assured knowing the amount of ounces that are in the bottle.
Yeah, I was able to let go of that a little bit, I think, because he was my third. I really followed his feeding cues, noticing when his hands would relax and he was just soothed. I felt confident in that, his diaper output, things like that. So I wasn't so concerned with it. And his weight also was never really, and that was never really the issue. We had all those things going for us.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you were able to gradually transition. It was
Yeah.
really just getting him on the breast and staying there.
Exactly. And knowing
And
that he was transferring enough from me.
yeah. Did you use any tools like a nipple shield or anything to help him get
I
on the
didn't
breast?
know.
Okay. So he just, do you remember how many weeks he was when he finally?
He was, by the time we gave up the pump, I would say he was about a month. So 4 weeks, 4 weeks old. And I will say for him, because he was a preemie, the positions mattered a lot. Side lying position and laid back were much more successful for getting him to latch than the standard cradle hold at first.
Okay. What would happen if you tried cradle hold?
He wouldn't be able to get that deep latch. It was painful. It was really painful for me. The side lying was actually the best, most comfortable for me, most comfortable latch for him. And I could tell he was able to latch and transfer that milk and swallow easiest.
Yeah, that's good to hear because sometimes people get stuck in one or two positions and sometimes it takes thinking outside the box a little bit. And if side lying works, you can do side lying for a month and then slowly try to transition to more convenient positions.
Exactly. Yeah, because eventually they all do the breast gymnastics when they're toddlers.
Right.
So,
exactly. Yeah. And a month can feel like a really long time when
Yeah.
you're wondering if your baby is ever going to transition off the bottle.
Yeah. I had those thoughts. It was a struggle. I wasn't sure. I really wasn't sure if he was ever going to exclusively breastfeed. And how, the other thing that was heavy was, how was I going to make this work with 2 other children at home? Because it was a lot to, my husband at that time was able to take some time off, but once he had to go back to work, it wasn't going to be feasible for me to breastfeed, pump, and then bottle feed, and then do it all over again every 2 to 3 hours.
Yeah.
So it was like looking down a dark tunnel for a while.
Yeah. I can see how you would be wondering what you were going to do. How much more time did he have off by the time it clicked?
He was able to get 6 weeks total. So I think he had 2 weeks left, roughly. Yeah.
Yeah. And had your middle already weaned by the time your third was born?
My middle weaned when I was pregnant. So it happened simultaneously. I was very pregnant in going into my 3rd trimester, and I also got COVID. So I think between the pregnancy and COVID, my supply naturally just went down at that time, and he self-weaned. So
yeah. Sometimes the milk changes and there's not as much. And was it painful for you at that time when he tried to nurse?
Oh yes, in pregnancy, both times actually. It was I forgot how much that nipple pain can hurt.
Yeah. I really thought I was going to tandem nurse my kids, but my oldest, it just hurt too bad. And I experienced a lot of pain during my first breastfeeding journey, and I just thought, you know what, I'm not going to go do this again.
Yeah,
I
for
stopped.
sure.
Yeah. So is there anything else about any of your experiences that you think is important to share?
I think just finding support and whatever that looks like for you, and knowing your resources even ahead of time, because everybody goes into breastfeeding or feeding their baby and having a vision of what they think it's going to be like or what they want it to be like. And I think a lot of times, most of the time, it may not exactly be that. And that's okay. There's going to be these twists and these turns, and it's going to become something else. And so just being able to pivot with it and go with it, knowing that everything is a phase and it's it all works out.
Yes, it all works out. And I love this idea of everything being a phase because it really is. And it goes both ways. Like you think you've got your baby figured out and that you know what their patterns are. And then as soon as you've got it figured out, it switches up. So whether that's breastfeeding or sleep or naps or eating, it's going to change in 3 months because they grow so rapidly.
Yeah, exactly. And even as a first-time mom, second-time mom, third-time mom, it's different every time. And you, in some ways, you're more experienced, but you also find yourself back at square one, kind of Googling the same questions that you did the first time.
Because it's a new person.
Yes.
And so you're getting to know a new person.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. I thank you so much for sharing your experiences. And I can't wait to have you back on to share your professional expertise when it comes to breast imaging and breast health. And is there anywhere that you want people to be able to connect with you now, just as a person and a mom, maybe even your La Leche League group or contact information?
Yes, I'm a leader in the local La Leche League group in Fairfield and Westport in Connecticut. So I'm always there for local support if needed.
Great. Yeah, we can link that information in the show notes for people to find.
Great. Perfect.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I love the message that Courtney gives. That reminds us that most struggles that come up with our kids really are a phase. And I personally have relied on this knowledge and this mindset for 11 years now as I have worked through the ups and downs of feeding each of my children from my body for over 3 years, and also as they have entered into different developmental stages. Sometimes our kids go through struggles that we can't identify. Sometimes something is going on inside of their body or their brain that is really frustrating or annoying to us. And I love this idea that it will work out. We have to do the best job we can in the moment. We have to pivot when necessary, but we can do it and it will be okay. So I hope this message resonates with you too. I can't wait to discuss what you think about this in the Milk Making Minutes community group on Facebook. I'll see you there.